The blood-red sunset painted the sky as Victoria Remington clutched the weathered deed to her land, her knuckles white with determination. 3 years of sweat, tears, and relentless work on this Montana homestead had transformed it from barren wilderness to a promising cattle ranch, and now the town of Utica wanted to snatch it away as if her efforts meant nothing. Victoria wiped a strand of auburn hair from her face and squinted at the horizon. In the distance, a lone figure on horseback approached her property line. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she reached for the shotgun propped beside her cabin door. At 26, Victoria had learned that in Montana Territory in 1876, a woman alone had to be twice as vigilant and 3 times as stubborn as any man. The rider drew closer, and Victoria stepped onto her porch, weapon in hand. She recognized the broad shoulders and the distinctive chestnut stallion Mason McKenzie, a quiet cowboy who occasionally did odd jobs around neighboring ranches. Victoria had never exchanged more than a few words with him, but his reputation as a skilled horseman and straight shooter preceded him. To her surprise, Mason didn't approach her cabin. Instead, he dismounted at the fence line marking the eastern boundary of her property, withdrew a rifle from his saddle holster, and took a position facing the direction of town. He stood there, still as stone, his Winchester cradled in his arms. Victoria descended the steps of her porch, curiosity overcoming caution. She approached within speaking distance, keeping her shotgun visible. "Mr. McKenzie, may I ask what you're doing on my property line with a rifle?" she called, her voice carrying across the golden grass. Mason turned slightly, his eyes never fully leaving the horizon. "Not on your property, madam. Just beside it." His voice was deep and unhurried, like distant thunder. "Heard in town they're planning to ride out here tonight. Thought you might appreciate an extra set of eyes." Victoria's throat tightened. "Who's planning to ride out?" "Mayor Hargrove and his associates. They've convinced half the town your land is needed for the railroad spur." He adjusted his stance, boots firmly planted in the dirt. "I don't take kindly to bullies, especially ones hiding behind progress as an excuse." Victoria studied him, searching for deceit but finding only quiet resolve in his weathered face. At perhaps 30 years of age, Mason McKenzie had the look of a man who had seen more than his share of hardship but hadn't let it harden his heart. "Why would you risk making enemies of the most powerful men in Utica for my sake?" Victoria asked, suspicion edging her voice. Mason's gaze finally met hers directly. "My father lost our family ranch in Texas to men like Hargrove. Men who decide what's yours is actually theirs when it suits them." He paused, adjusting the brim of his hat. "Besides, this is still America, Miss Remington. Property rights should mean something." Before Victoria could respond, dust clouds appeared on the horizon, and the distant sound of hoofbeats grew steadily louder. Mason nodded toward her cabin. "You might want to take cover, madam. No telling how this will play out." Victoria straightened her spine. "This is my land, Mr. McKenzie. I won't be hiding in my cabin while others decide its fate." She checked her shotgun and moved to stand beside him at the fence line. The corner of Mason's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Figured you might say something like that." As the riders approached, Victoria could make out Mayor Hargrove's portly figure leading a group of 7 men, including Sheriff Bowman and several businessmen she recognized from town. The sight of the law riding alongside those intent on taking her land sent a chill through her body, but she stood firm, shotgun ready. The party slowed as they neared the fence line, clearly surprised to find not only Victoria waiting for them but an armed cowboy as well. "Evening, gentlemen," Victoria called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "You're a long way from town." Mayor Hargrove, a man whose substantial girth spoke of his success in business, pulled his horse to a stop and frowned at the sight of Mason. "McKenzie," he acknowledged tersely before turning to Victoria. "Miss Remington, We've come to discuss the matter of your property. As I'm sure you're aware, the Northern Pacific Railroad is planning an important spur line through this region, and your land sits at a crucial junction. Victoria's grip tightened on her shotgun. There's nothing to discuss, Mayor. I have no intention of selling. Sheriff Bowman moved his horse forward. Now, Miss Remington, be reasonable. The town council has made a fair offer, considering the circumstances. Fair. Victoria's laugh was sharp and without humor. Half the market value isn't fair by any measure, Sheriff. And threatening to condemn my property if I don't accept is nothing short of theft. Mason shifted his weight, drawing attention to his presence and the rifle in his hands. Sounds like the lady's not interested in your offer, he said quietly. Might be best if you gentlemen rode back to town and reconsidered your approach. One of the businessmen, Harold Jenkins, the banker, scoffed loudly. This doesn't concern you, McKenzie. Why don't you mind your own business? I make it my business when I see 7 men riding out to pressure one woman after sundown, Mason replied, his tone unchanged but somehow more dangerous. Mayor Hargrove's face reddened. Are you threatening officials of this town, sir? Mason shook his head slowly. Not threatening anyone, just standing on public land observing. And I'll continue observing until you gentlemen leave Miss Remington to her rightful property. Sheriff Bowman's hand drifted toward his holster. That rifle in your hands tells a different story. It's dangerous country, Mason replied. Man would be foolish to ride without protection. Same as a woman would be foolish to face 7 men without a friend nearby. Victoria felt a surge of gratitude toward this near stranger who had positioned himself as her defender. Gentlemen, it's getting dark. I suggest you return to town. My answer remains no today, and it will be no tomorrow. A tense silence stretched between the two groups. Victoria could see the frustration in Mayor Hargrove's eyes, but she also noted the uncertainty. They had expected to find her alone, to use their numbers to intimidate her. Mason's presence had disrupted their plan. Finally, the mayor tugged on his horse's reins. This isn't over, Miss Remington. Progress comes whether we welcome it or not. Better to profit from it than stand in its way. My profit comes from my cattle and my land, Mayor. I'll thank you to remember that. The men turned their horses around, but Sheriff Bowman lingered a moment longer, his gaze fixed on Mason. You're making a mistake taking sides against the town's interests, McKenzie. Mason didn't respond, simply holding the sheriff's stare until the lawman turned his horse and rejoined the others. Only when the riders were distant specks on the horizon did Victoria allow her shoulders to relax. They'll be back, she said, more to herself than to Mason. He nodded, lowering his rifle but not returning it to its holster. Most likely. Men like that don't give up easy when there's money to be made. Victoria turned to face him fully. Why did you really come out here today, Mr. McKenzie? Truth now. Mason considered her for a long moment. I told you the truth. Mason appeared momentarily caught off guard by the invitation, then nodded. Be obliged, Miss Remington, though I should check your fence line first. Make sure we don't get any unexpected visitors. As Mason mounted his horse to ride the perimeter of her property, Victoria walked back to her cabin, a strange mixture of worry and comfort settling in her chest. The town's threat remained, but for the first time since receiving the mayor's ultimatum a week ago, she didn't feel entirely alone in her fight. Inside her modest cabin, Victoria stoked the fire in the cook stove and added ingredients to the stew she'd started earlier. The cabin was small but well built, every nail and board put in place by her own hands or those of the occasional hired help she could afford. After her father died on the journey west, leaving her alone at 23 with nothing but a land claim and determination, Victoria had taught herself everything from basic carpentry to animal husbandry. Through the window, She watched Mason McKenzie methodically riding her property line, occasionally dismounting to examine something on the ground. There was an efficiency to his movements that spoke of a lifetime spent in the saddle. Victoria found herself wondering about his story, what had brought him to Montana territory, why he worked as a hired hand rather than establishing his own ranch, what made him willing to stand against the town for a woman he barely knew. By the time Mason returned to the cabin and hitched his horse to the post outside, Victoria had the table set with her modest but hearty fare: venison stew, cornbread, and coffee. Mason removed his hat upon entering, revealing dark hair in need of a trim. He stood awkwardly just inside the door, looking too large for the small cabin with its simple furnishings. "Everything secure?" Victoria asked, gesturing for him to take a seat at the table. Mason nodded, placing his hat on a hook by the door before sitting down. "No signs of anyone else about?" "They've gone back to town to regroup, I expect." Victoria served the stew and sat across from him. For a few minutes, they ate in silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the occasional pop from the fire in the stove. "This is good," Mason said finally, breaking the silence. "Been a while since I had a home-cooked meal." "Where do you take your meals usually?" Victoria asked. "Boarding house in town? Or camping under the stars when I'm working distant ranches?" He took another bite of stew. "Mrs. Parnell at the boarding house tries, but her idea of seasoning is a prayer over the pot." Victoria smiled despite herself. "And where is home for you, Mr. McKenzie? You mentioned Texas." Mason's expression grew distant. "Was Texas. Haven't had a place to truly call home since the war ended and we lost our ranch." He paused, seeming to consider how much to share. "Been drifting since '68. Montana's the longest I've stayed anywhere, going on 2 years now." "And what keeps you here?" Victoria asked, genuinely curious. Mason looked around the cabin, then out the window at the vast Montana landscape, now darkened with night. The space, maybe. Room to breathe. Less crowded memories. His eyes returned to hers. "What about you? Most women don't choose to homestead alone. Most women don't have much choice in what they do," Victoria replied, a hint of defiance in her tone. "My father had the dream, but he died before we reached Montana. I could have turned back, found a husband to provide for me. But this land was our dream, and I decided it would be my reality." Mason studied her with newfound respect. "That takes courage." Victoria shrugged, uncomfortable with his admiration. "It takes stubbornness, mostly, and a willingness to go to bed exhausted every night." She rose to refill their coffee cups. "Now, tell me what you know about the town's plans. I need to understand what I'm up against." Mason wrapped his hands around the warm coffee mug. "The Northern Pacific has been looking to put in a spur line to connect Utica directly to their main route. Would make shipping cattle and goods a lot easier, bring more business to town. And my land sits where they want to build," Victoria concluded. "Your land has the only viable pass through the eastern hills for miles. Without it, they'd have to go 20 miles south, which adds cost and time." Mason took a sip of his coffee. "Mayor Hargrove and some of the businessmen have heavily invested in the railroad's expansion. They stand to profit considerably if the spur goes through." Victoria frowned. "So it's not just about progress for the town. It's about lining their pockets." "Usually is," Mason replied simply. "Word is, they've got investors from back east waiting on confirmation that the right-of-way has been secured. If they can't deliver your land, they might lose their financing. Which explains their urgency and their low offer." Victoria's mind raced with this new information. "What else have you heard?" Mason hesitated. "There's talk they might try to challenge your claim itself. Find some technicality in how it was filed or transferred after your father passed." Victoria's blood ran cold. She'd been meticulous with the paperwork, knowing as a woman alone she'd be scrutinized more heavily than a man. But the territorial land offices were notoriously disorganized. They'd go that far? Money makes men do things they'd otherwise consider beneath them, Mason said quietly, especially when they believe they're entitled to what they want. Victoria stood abruptly and moved to a small desk in the corner of the cabin. From a drawer, she withdrew a leather folder containing all her documentation, the original land claim, the transfer paperwork after her father's death, tax receipts, the official deed. She'd kept everything in perfect order, but doubt now crept into her mind. "I should take these to Helena," she murmured, more to herself than to Mason. "File additional copies with the territorial office, just to be safe." Mason rose from the table. "That's wise. But Helena's a 3-day ride, and I don't think you should leave your property unattended right now." Victoria turned to face him, suddenly aware of how close he stood and how his presence filled the small cabin. "What are you suggesting?" "I could take them for you," he offered. "I know people in the land office who can ensure everything is properly recorded." Victoria clutched the documents tighter. "These papers are all that stand between me and ruin. I can't just hand them over to someone I barely know." Mason didn't appear offended by her hesitation. "Make copies, then. I'll take the copies to be filed, and you keep the originals safe." It was a reasonable suggestion, but Victoria shook her head. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't trust that copies would be treated with the same weight as originals if it came to a legal challenge." She returned the documents to their drawer. "I'll figure something out." Mason nodded, respecting her decision. "Whatever you decide, you should know that Hargrove and his men won't give up easily, and they have influence with the territorial officials." "Are you trying to frighten me into selling, Mr. Mackenzie?" Victoria asked sharply. "No, madam. Just making sure you understand what you're up against." He moved toward the door, retrieving his hat. "It's getting late. I should head back to town." Victoria suddenly realized she didn't want him to leave. With night fallen and the town's intentions clear, the thought of being alone made her uneasy. "It's a long ride in the dark," she said. "You're welcome to sleep in the barn if you'd prefer not to travel tonight." Mason paused, hat in hand. "Are you sure that's wise? People talk, Miss Remington." "Your reputation." "My reputation is already that of an eccentric woman who refuses to know her place," Victoria interrupted with a wry smile. "Besides, you'd be in the barn, not the house. And given the circumstances, I think having someone keep watch tonight might be prudent." After a moment's consideration, Mason nodded. "All right, I'll take you up on that offer." He settled his hat back on his head. "I'll tend to my horse and keep an eye out. Try to get some sleep, Miss Remington. Tomorrow may be a long day." After Mason left for the barn, Victoria secured the cabin doors and windows, then prepared for bed. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she lay thinking about Mason McKenzie standing guard at her fence line, about the town's determination to take her land, about the uncertain days ahead. Outside, the Montana night wrapped around her small homestead, stars brilliant in the vast sky above. In the barn, Mason McKenzie settled into the hay, rifle close at hand, his thoughts similarly occupied with the brave, stubborn woman fighting to keep her dream alive and the men determined to take it from her. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the Montana landscape, painting the distant mountains in hues of pink and gold. Victoria had risen before first light, as was her custom, and was already drawing water from the well when she heard the barn door open. Mason emerged, looking remarkably alert for someone who had spent the night on a barn floor. "Good morning, Miss Remington," he called, approaching the well to help with the heavy bucket. "Victoria," she corrected him, surrendering the bucket to his stronger arms. "If you're going to help defend my land, you might as well use my given name." Mason nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. Victoria, then. And I'm Mason. They walked together toward the cabin, the morning dew soaking the hems of Victoria's skirts. Any disturbances in the night? She asked. None. Just some coyotes making a fuss about midnight. Mason set the water bucket by the cabin door. But that doesn't mean they've given up. Victoria sighed, pushing a strand of hair back under her bonnet. No, I expect not. I've been thinking about what you said regarding the land office. Perhaps I should ride to Helena after all. Mason shook his head. I still think leaving now is risky. They might try to claim abandonment, especially if they have the sheriff in their pocket. Victoria hadn't considered that angle, and it deepened her frustration. Then I'm trapped here while they plot against me. Not exactly trapped, Mason replied thoughtfully. And not alone either. Victoria studied him, trying to understand his meaning. You can't stay here indefinitely, Mason. You have your own livelihood to consider. Actually, I've been thinking about that. Mason leaned against the porch railing, looking out over her land. You've got close to 100 head of cattle, from what I can see. That's too many for one person to manage properly. You need help, especially with winter coming. Victoria bristled slightly at the suggestion she couldn't handle her own ranch, even though she knew he was right. I hire hands when absolutely necessary. And pay them with what? Every spare cent you have goes back into the ranch. Mason's assessment was accurate but not unkind. I'm proposing a more permanent arrangement. I've saved a bit working odd jobs. Enough to buy in as a partner if you're amenable. Victoria stared at him, astonished. A partner? You hardly know me or this ranch. I know enough, Mason replied simply. I know you've built something worth fighting for. I know the land has potential that you haven't had the manpower to fully realize. And I know that two people standing against Hargrove and his cronies have a better chance than one. The proposition was unexpected and not unwelcome, but Victoria had learned caution the hard way. And what would this partnership entail, exactly? I put in my savings and my labor. We split the ranch duties and any profits. I help you improve the herd and expand the operation. Mason's expression was earnest. And most importantly, my name on the deed alongside yours makes it harder for them to challenge your claim. Victoria's heart skipped at the mention of her deed. You're suggesting this as a business arrangement, then? Mason nodded. Purely business. You'd maintain control of your homestead, but with additional resources and protection. It was a practical solution to her immediate problem, but Victoria hesitated. I've worked too hard for this land to risk losing any part of it, even to a well-meaning partner. We can draw up terms that protect your interests, Mason assured her. I'm not looking to take over your ranch, Victoria. I'm looking for a place to put down roots, to build something lasting. He paused, then added quietly, and maybe to help someone else keep what's rightfully theirs in the process. Before Victoria could respond, the sound of an approaching rider caught their attention. Both turned to see Sheriff Bowman approaching, alone this time, his bay gelding kicking up dust along the trail. Mason straightened, one hand casually moving closer to his holstered revolver. Victoria smoothed her apron and stepped forward, determined to present a calm, confident front. Sheriff Bowman reined in his horse at a respectful distance. Morning, Miss Remington. He nodded briefly to Mason. McKenzie. What brings you out so early, Sheriff? Victoria asked, her tone carefully neutral. The sheriff dismounted, removing his hat as he approached. Official business, I'm afraid. Mayor Hargrove has filed a formal complaint with the territorial court challenging your land claim. Victoria's stomach dropped, but she kept her expression composed. On what grounds? Technical irregularities in the transfer from your father's name to yours, Bowman replied, producing an official-looking document from his vest pocket. This is a summons to appear before Judge Hollister next Tuesday to address the challenge. Victoria took the paper, fighting to keep her hand steady. How convenient that Judge Hollister is Mayor Hargrove's brother-in-law. Sheriff Bowman had the decency to look uncomfortable. The law is the law, Miss Remington. I'm just delivering the notice as required. Mason stepped forward. And what evidence does the mayor claim to have of these irregularities? That's for the judge to consider, Bowman replied, his gaze hardening as he looked at Mason. Though I'm curious why you're still here, McKenzie. This matter doesn't concern you. Actually, it does, Mason said evenly. Miss Remington and I are discussing a business partnership regarding this ranch. The sheriff's eyebrows shot up, and he looked between the two of them. Is that so? Awful sudden, isn't it? Victoria lifted her chin. My business arrangements are my own concern, Sheriff. Now, if you've delivered your notice, I have work to attend to. Bowman replaced his hat, his expression troubled. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Miss Remington. The railroad's coming whether you like it or not. Fighting it will only cost you in the end. My land is not for sale at any price, Victoria replied firmly. Please convey that message to the mayor. The sheriff mounted his horse, looking down at them with a mixture of frustration and something that might have been regret. Tuesday, 10 o'clock. Judge Hollister doesn't appreciate tardiness. With that, he turned his horse and rode back toward town. Victoria waited until he was out of earshot before unfolding the summons with trembling fingers. The legal language was dense and intimidating, but the meaning was clear. Her right to her land was being formally challenged. This is worse than I thought, she murmured, scanning the document. They're claiming my father's death invalidated the original claim because the transfer wasn't properly witnessed by a territorial official. Mason took the paper when she offered it, reading quickly. This is a stretch even for Hargrove. Your father died before the claim was fully processed. Victoria nodded, moving to sit on the porch steps as the weight of the situation settled on her shoulders. He died on the trail here. We had the paperwork, but it wasn't officially filed until I arrived and completed the claim in my own name. She pressed her fingers to her temples. I had everything witnessed by the land agent in Helena, but he's since moved on. I don't know if the records were properly maintained. Mason sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the morning chill. Then we have 4 days to prepare your defense. Victoria looked up sharply. My offer stands, Mason said quietly. Partnership or not, I'm not leaving you to face this alone. Victoria studied his face, searching for any sign of ulterior motives but finding only sincere determination. In just one day, this man had become her staunchest ally in a fight she had been preparing to face alone. Why? She asked simply. Why risk making powerful enemies for my sake? Mason was quiet for a moment, his gaze moving over the ranch, the small cabin, the corral, the grazing cattle, the mountains rising majestically in the distance. Because some things are worth fighting for, he finally said. Because I've spent too many years drifting, watching good people lose what's theirs to men with more money than conscience. He turned to look at her directly. And because you've built something remarkable here, Victoria Remington. Something that deserves to be protected. The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within her. A place Victoria had protected since her father's death had left her alone in the world. She had built walls around her heart as sturdy as those of her cabin, necessary fortifications against a world that had little use for a woman with ambitions beyond marriage and motherhood. All right, she said, coming to a decision. Let's discuss this partnership of yours properly. But first, we need to prepare for Tuesday. Mason nodded, standing and offering his hand to help her up. We should ride to Helena today. Even if the original land agent is gone, there will be records. And Judge Hollister may be Hargrove's brother-in-law, but even he can't ignore properly filed documentation. Victoria accepted his hand, feeling the strength and calluses that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. That's a 2-day journey each way. We'd barely make it back in time for the hearing. Then we'd better get started, Mason replied, already moving toward the barn. Pack only what you need. We'll ride hard and fast. Within the hour, they had saddled their horses and prepared for the journey. Victoria had changed into her riding clothes, split skirts that scandalized the town ladies but allowed her to ride astride like a man, and packed her precious documents securely in a leather satchel. She'd also asked her nearest neighbor, old Jim Watkins, to keep an eye on her property during her absence. As they mounted up, Victoria cast a worried glance back at her cabin. What if they try something while we're gone? Jim will raise the alarm if anyone comes snooping, Mason assured her. And Hargrove won't make a move until after the hearing. He's trying to maintain a veneer of legality. Victoria wasn't entirely convinced but knew they had no choice. They rode out together, heading north toward Helena, the territorial capital. The journey would take them through rugged country, but both were experienced riders accustomed to the demands of Montana's terrain. They rode steadily throughout the day, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat the provisions Victoria had packed. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Mason suggested they make camp in a sheltered grove near a small stream. Victoria dismounted, stretching her stiff limbs while Mason tended to the horses. Despite the urgency of their mission, she found herself admiring the efficiency with which he moved, the quiet competence in his hands as he unsaddled the animals and checked them for any signs of strain. "You're good with horses," she commented, gathering wood for a small fire. Mason glanced up, a half-smile on his lips. "Grew up with them. My father raised quarter horses in Texas before the war. Had a way with them that I tried to learn." "And did you learn his way?" "Some of it," Mason replied, running a gentle hand down his stallion's neck. "Enough to know that trust goes both ways. Horse has to trust you won't lead it into danger, and you have to trust it knows when something's not right." He secured the horses where they could graze, then came to help with the fire. "Same with people, I suppose?" Victoria watched as he expertly arranged the kindling. "Is that why you've spent years drifting? Trust is hard to come by." Mason struck a match, carefully nurturing the small flame. "Partly. After the war, Texas wasn't the same. Too many bitter memories. Too many good men gone." The fire caught, casting flickering light across his features. "And maybe I was looking for something I couldn't name. And have you found it?" Victoria asked softly, settling on her bedroll across from him. Mason looked up, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "I'm beginning to think I might have." The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Victoria busied herself preparing their simple supper of jerky, hard bread, and coffee, while Mason completed setting up their camp. As night fully descended, wrapping them in darkness relieved only by their small fire and the brilliant canopy of stars above, Victoria found herself unexpectedly comfortable in Mason's presence. She had grown accustomed to solitude over the past 3 years, finding companionship primarily in her animals and occasional visits from neighbors. Yet sitting across the fire from this quiet, thoughtful man felt strangely natural. "Tell me about your ranch in Texas," she said as they finished their meal. "What was it like?" Mason leaned back, propping himself on one elbow. "Beautiful country. Different from here, more open, less dramatic. We had close to 200 acres, most of it good grazing land with a creek running through the middle." His voice took on a wistful quality. "House wasn't much, but my mother had planted roses that climbed all over the porch. You could smell them from half a mile away on a warm day." "It sounds lovely," Victoria said, trying to picture the distant Texas homestead. It was. Mason's expression darkened slightly. Until the war came, I joined up in '62, fought with the Texas cavalry. By the time I made it home in '65, my father was dead, my mother trying to hold things together with help from our foreman. He stared into the fire. Taxes had piled up during the war years. Reconstruction policies hit Confederate states hard. We managed for a while, but by '68, the bank foreclosed. Victoria felt a pang of sympathy. And your mother? Lives with my sister in San Antonio now. Mason poked at the fire with a stick. I send what I can when work is steady. He looked up at Victoria. What about you? Any family besides your father? Victoria shook her head. My mother died when I was 14. It was just father and me after that. He was a dreamer, always chasing the next opportunity. Montana was to be our fresh start. She wrapped her arms around her knees. When he died on the trail, I could have turned back, found relatives in Missouri to take me in. But something about this land called to me. Even then, Mason nodded in understanding. It gets in your blood. The space, the freedom. Exactly. Victoria smiled, pleased he understood. In Missouri, I would have been married off quickly, expected to be content with a house and children. But here, she gestured to the vast darkness around them, encompassing the wilderness. Here I can be more than someone's wife or daughter. I can build something of my own. You've done that, Mason said quietly. Most men couldn't have accomplished what you have in 3 years. The compliment warmed her more than it should have. Thank you. Though right now, everything I've built is at risk. Mason's expression grew serious. We'll fight for it, Victoria, and we'll win. The conviction in his voice gave her strength she hadn't realized she needed. For 3 years, she had stood alone against the elements, predators, and occasional human threats. Having someone firmly in her corner was a novel experience and a dangerously comforting one. We should get some rest, she said, breaking the moment before emotion could overwhelm her. We have a long ride tomorrow. Mason nodded, banking the fire for the night. I'll take first watch. You sleep. Victoria wanted to protest that she didn't need guarding, but the events of the past 2 days had left her exhausted. She settled into her bedroll, watching as Mason positioned himself against a tree, rifle across his lap, his silhouette a reassuring presence against the night sky. Despite her worries about the coming legal battle, Victoria fell asleep quickly, lulled by the soft sounds of the wilderness and the knowledge that, for tonight at least, she wasn't facing her troubles alone. They reached Helena late the following afternoon, the territorial capital bustling with activity that made Utica seem like little more than a quiet outpost in comparison. Government buildings of imposing stone stood alongside wooden structures housing businesses of all kinds, with people hurrying in every direction. Victoria and Mason made their way directly to the land office, a substantial building near the center of town. Inside, clerks moved busily between desks stacked with papers, maps hung on the walls, and the air smelled of ink and dust. An older gentleman with spectacles perched on his nose looked up as they approached his desk. May I help you? Victoria stepped forward. I need to verify land records for a homestead claim in Mara County, near Utica. The claim was originally filed in 1873. The clerk nodded, gesturing to a bench along the wall. Have a seat. I'll need to check the county records. While they waited, Victoria nervously clutched her satchel containing her documents. Mason placed a reassuring hand on her arm. It's going to be all right, he said quietly. After what seemed an eternity, the clerk returned with a large ledger. Name of the claimant? Originally Richard Remington, transferred to Victoria Remington upon his death during the journey to the territory, Victoria explained, standing to approach the desk. The clerk flipped through the ledger, running his finger down columns of neat script. Ah yes, Remington claim, 160 acres, 6 miles east of Utica. He adjusted his spectacles. There appears to be a note here regarding the transfer. Victoria's heart sank. What kind of note? It indicates the transfer was processed under unusual circumstances, given the claimant's death prior to taking possession. The clerk looked up. Do you have the original transfer documentation? Victoria quickly produced her papers from the satchel. Everything is here, including the witness statements confirming my father's verbal transfer of the claim to me before his death. The clerk examined the documents carefully, comparing them to the ledger entries. Mason stood close behind Victoria, a silent support as she waited for the verdict. These appear to be in order, the clerk finally said. The transfer was properly recorded by Agent Thomas before he was reassigned to Wyoming territory. He looked up at Victoria. However, I see that Mayor Hargrove from Utica has recently requested copies of these records, citing concerns about their validity. Victoria's jaw tightened. The mayor has no grounds for such concerns. My claim is legitimate. That may be so, the clerk replied neutrally, but he's filed a formal inquiry with Judge Hollister's court. Mason leaned forward. We're aware of the hearing scheduled for Tuesday. We need certified copies of all records pertaining to Miss Remington's claim to present as evidence. The clerk hesitated. Preparing certified copies requires authorization from the headland agent, and he's away until Monday. This can't wait until Monday, Victoria insisted, desperation edging her voice. The hearing is Tuesday morning. Mason placed a calm hand on her shoulder before addressing the clerk. Sir, this is a matter of justice. Mayor Hargrove and his associates are attempting to force Miss Remington off her legally obtained land for their own profit. Surely there must be someone with authority to provide these copies today. The clerk looked between them, then sighed. Wait here. He disappeared through a door at the back of the office. Victoria turned to Mason, worry etched on her face. If we can't get these copies, we will, Mason assured her, though his own concern was evident. And if not, we'll find another way. Nearly 30 minutes passed before the clerk returned, accompanied by an older man with a military bearing and a neatly trimmed white beard. This is Colonel Jameson, acting land administrator in the head agent's absence, the clerk explained. Colonel Jameson surveyed them with keen eyes. My clerk tells me you're facing a challenge to your land claim, Miss Remington. Yes, sir, Victoria replied. A challenge I believe is motivated by the railroad's desire for a right-of-way through my property. The colonel nodded thoughtfully. I've seen similar tactics employed elsewhere. Progress is important, but not at the expense of legally established property rights. He turned to the clerk. Prepare certified copies of all documents relating to the Remington claim immediately. I'll sign them myself. Relief washed over Victoria. Thank you, Colonel. You have no idea what this means to me. I think I do, young lady, he replied with a small smile. My own daughter homesteaded in Dakota Territory after losing her husband. I know the challenges women face in establishing themselves in the West. He gave her an appraising look. It takes exceptional fortitude. While the clerk busied himself making copies, Colonel Jameson asked Victoria about her ranch and the improvements she'd made to the land. His questions were knowledgeable and respectful, showing none of the condescension she typically encountered when discussing her business with men. Mason stood quietly by, adding occasional details about the quality of Victoria's cattle operation that she hadn't thought to mention. His evident admiration for what she'd accomplished warmed her in unexpected ways. Finally, the clerk returned with a sealed packet. These are certified copies of all relevant documents, including the original claim, the transfer authorization, and witness statements regarding your father's intentions. Colonel Jameson explained as he handed them to Victoria. "I've also included a letter stating that our office finds no irregularities in your claim." Victoria clutched the precious packet. "I don't know how to thank you, Colonel." "No thanks necessary. Just keep building that ranch of yours." He glanced at Mason. "And it appears you've found a good man to help you do it." Victoria felt herself blush slightly. "Mr. McKenzie is a potential business partner." The Colonel's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Of course. Well, I wish you both success in your business endeavors." They left the land office with renewed hope, the certified documents securely stored in Victoria's satchel. As they walked toward the hotel where they planned to spend the night before beginning the journey back to Utica, Mason suggested they consult a lawyer while in Helena. "Colonel Jameson's letter will help, but having legal representation at the hearing would strengthen our position," he pointed out. Victoria nodded, though her heart sank at the thought of additional expense. "Do you know of anyone suitable?" "There's a lawyer named Michael Sullivan who has a reputation for standing against railroad interests. His office is near the courthouse." They found Sullivan's office easily enough, a modest establishment with a simple shingle identifying it as Sullivan Legal Services. Inside, a harried-looking clerk informed them that Mr. Sullivan was currently with a client, but could see them in half an hour if the matter was urgent. Victoria and Mason decided to wait, settling onto a bench in the small outer office. As they sat side by side, Victoria became acutely aware of Mason's presence, the solid warmth of him, the faint scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to his clothing, the quiet strength he exuded without effort. "Thank you," she said softly, breaking the silence between them, "for everything you've done. I wouldn't have known where to start with all this." Mason shook his head. "You would have figured it out. You're remarkably capable, Victoria. Perhaps. But having you beside me has made this fight seem less overwhelming." She hesitated, then added, "Whatever happens on Tuesday, I won't forget that." Mason turned to face her fully, something unreadable in his expression. "Victoria, the inner door opened before he could finish, and a portly businessman emerged, followed by a lean man with shrewd eyes and prematurely gray hair. Michael Sullivan, presumably. "Miss Remington? Mr. McKenzie?" the lawyer called, consulting a note from his clerk. "Please, come in." Inside Sullivan's office, they explained the situation in detail: Victoria's land claim, the town's attempt to force her out for the railroad spur, the upcoming hearing before Judge Hollister. Sullivan listened attentively, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. When they had finished, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Judge Hollister has a reputation for favoring development interests, but he's not corrupt, just biased toward what he considers progress." He gestured toward Victoria's satchel. "Those certified documents from the land office will be crucial, particularly Colonel Jameson's letter." "But is it enough?" Victoria pressed. Sullivan considered for a moment. "With proper representation, yes, I believe so. The transfer of your claim appears to have followed all legal requirements, even if the circumstances were unusual." "Then you'll represent me at the hearing?" Victoria asked hopefully. Sullivan's expression became apologetic. "Unfortunately, I'm due in court in Bozeman on Tuesday for another case." He raised a hand to forestall their disappointment. "However, I can prepare written arguments for you to present, and advise you on how to handle the proceedings." It wasn't ideal, but it was better than facing Judge Hollister with no legal guidance at all. They spent the next 2 hours with Sullivan, going through each potential challenge to Victoria's claim and crafting responses. By the time they left his office, Victoria felt better equipped to defend her rights, though anxiety still churned in her stomach at the thought of the coming confrontation. They secured rooms at a modest hotel near the center of town, agreeing to meet for an early breakfast before starting the journey back to Utica at dawn. In the privacy of her small room, Victoria carefully reviewed all the documents again, rehearsing the arguments Sullivan had provided. The lawyer had been cautiously optimistic about their chances, but had also warned that powerful interests often found ways to achieve their goals regardless of legal niceties. A soft knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find Mason standing in the hallway, hat in hand. "I thought you might like to get some supper," he said. "There's a decent-looking establishment across the street." Victoria suddenly realized she was famished, having eaten nothing since their brief noon meal. "That sounds wonderful. Let me just put these away." The restaurant was busy but not crowded, with checkered tablecloths and hearty frontier fare. They were shown to a table near a window overlooking the main street, now lit by gas lamps as evening descended on the territorial capital. Once they had ordered, Victoria found herself relaxing for the first time since receiving the sheriff's summons. "This almost feels normal," she remarked. "Sitting in a restaurant like ordinary people without land disputes hanging over our heads." Mason smiled, and Victoria was struck by how it transformed his usually serious face. "Been a while since I sat down to a proper meal with a beautiful woman," he said, then immediately looked abashed at his own forwardness. Victoria felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "I imagine you've had plenty of opportunities for such company, Mr. Mackenzie," she replied, reverting to formality to mask her flustered response. "Not many that mattered," he said quietly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. Their food arrived, breaking the moment, and conversation turned to more practical matters: the journey back to Utica, preparations for the hearing, contingency plans should Judge Hollister rule against them. Yet Victoria found herself repeatedly drawn to studying Mason's face when he wasn't looking, the strong line of his jaw, the tiny crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that deepened when he smiled, the way his dark hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. After supper, they walked back to the hotel in companionable silence, the streets of Helena still bustling with evening activity. At the door to her room, Victoria paused, suddenly reluctant to end their time together. "Dawn comes early," Mason said, seeming to share her hesitation. "We should get some rest." Victoria nodded. "Yes, of course." She unlocked her door, then turned back to him. "Mason, I've been thinking about your partnership proposal." His expression grew attentive. "And if we succeed on Tuesday when we succeed," she corrected herself, "I'd like to discuss the details. I think it could be good for the ranch. And for me." A slow smile spread across Mason's face. "I'd like that very much, Victoria." "Good night, then," she said softly. "Good night." He tipped his hat slightly before turning toward his own room. Victoria closed her door, leaning against it as a flood of unfamiliar emotions washed over her. In just 3 days, Mason McKenzie had upended her carefully ordered existence, bringing both complication and possibility into a life that had been defined by solitary determination. The thought should have frightened her, yet instead she found herself looking forward to whatever the future might hold, assuming, of course, they could first save her ranch from Mayor Hargrove's machinations. The journey back to Utica was harder than the ride to Helena had been, with dark clouds gathering and a bitter wind blowing from the north. By the time they reached Victoria's ranch late Monday evening, they were chilled to the bone and exhausted from fighting the elements. Jim Watkins had kept his promise to watch over the property, and reported that while Sheriff Bowman had ridden by once, no one had attempted to approach the cabin or interfere with the livestock. The old rancher seemed both surprised and approving of Mason's continued presence, giving Victoria a knowing look that she pointedly ignored as she thanked him for his vigilance. After Watkins departed, Victoria and Mason worked together to tend to their horses and check on the cattle, moving with the easy coordination of those accustomed to hard work. Despite their exhaustion, There was a comfort in returning to the physical routine of ranch life after the mental demands of their time in Helena. Inside the cabin, Victoria built up the fire while Mason brought in more firewood. The small space quickly warmed, and Victoria prepared a simple meal from her store's beans, salt pork, and biscuits left by Jim's wife. As they ate, they reviewed their strategy for the hearing once more. Sullivan's written arguments were clear and compelling, but much would depend on Judge Hollister's willingness to consider their evidence fairly. "What if we lose?" Victoria finally asked, voicing the fear that had haunted her throughout their journey home. Mason set down his coffee cup. "Then we appeal to the Territorial Supreme Court." Victoria shook her head. "That could take months, even years. The railroad won't wait that long." She stared into the fire. "They'll find a way to force me off the land while the appeal is pending." "I won't let that happen," Mason said with quiet intensity. "You may not be able to stop it," Victoria replied, meeting his gaze directly. "One man against the combined forces of the town council and the Northern Pacific?" Mason reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Not one man. Together." His grip was warm and steady. "Victoria, I meant what I said about a partnership. But it's more than that now, and I think you know it." Victoria's heart hammered in her chest. In just a few days, this man had become essential to her in ways she'd never anticipated. The thought of facing the future without him by her side left her cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "Mason, She struggled to find words for feelings she'd never expected to experience. "This has all happened so quickly." "Some things don't need time," he said simply. "Some things you just know." A loud knock at the door shattered the moment. Victoria jumped to her feet, while Mason moved swiftly to retrieve his rifle from beside the door. "Who's there?" Victoria called, her voice steadier than she felt. "Jim Watkins, Miss Victoria. Got urgent news." Victoria opened the door to find her elderly neighbor standing on her porch, his breath creating clouds in the cold night air. "What is it, Jim?" "Overheard something at the saloon I thought you should know," Watkins said, stepping inside and nodding a greeting to Mason. "Mayor Hargrove's been boasting that Judge Hollister's already decided against you, hearing or no hearing." Victoria exchanged an alarmed glance with Mason. "That can't be legal." "Legal don't matter much when money's involved," Watkins replied grimly. "Word is, the railroad investors are arriving on tomorrow's stage to finalize arrangements, expecting the right-of-way to be secured." Mason's expression darkened. "So the hearing is just for show. They never intended to give Victoria a fair chance." "There's more," Watkins continued. "Sheriff's deputized 4 men to maintain order if there's any trouble following the hearing. Talk is, they're prepared to remove you from the property immediately if necessary." Victoria sank back into her chair, the implications hitting her like a physical blow. "They've planned everything. The hearing, the investors' arrival, the deputies." She looked up at Mason, despair threatening to overwhelm her. "We never had a chance." Mason was silent for a long moment, his jaw tight with anger. Then, surprisingly, a slow smile spread across his face. "Actually, I think we might have just been handed one." Victoria stared at him in confusion. "What do you mean?" "If the investors are coming tomorrow expecting the right-of-way to be secured." Mason turned to Watkins. "Jim, how many ranchers in the area have grievances with Mayor Hargrove or the town council?" The old man snorted. "Just about all of us smaller operators. They've been favoring the big spreads for years, charging us higher rates for water access, giving the prime grazing contracts to their friends." Mason nodded as if this confirmed something. "And how many would be willing to stand up if someone finally took a stand against them?" Understanding began to dawn on Victoria. "You're thinking of organizing resistance." I'm thinking that Mayor Hargrove and Judge Hollister need to understand that their backroom dealings affect real people who won't be bullied, Mason replied. Jim, can you spread the word tonight? Ask everyone who's willing to show up at the courthouse tomorrow morning before the hearing. Watkins grinned, revealing several missing teeth. Be my pleasure, son. High time somebody challenged that pompous jackass. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. What exactly should I tell them to expect? Mason glanced at Victoria, including her in the decision. Tell them to come prepared to stand with a neighbor against injustice. Nothing illegal, nothing violent. Just a show of solidarity. After Watkins departed, Victoria turned to Mason. What exactly are you planning? A lesson in democracy, Mason replied, his eyes alight with purpose. Mayor Hargrove thinks he can ignore the law because he has power and influence. But in this country, the people are supposed to be the ultimate authority. Victoria felt a surge of hope, but caution tempered her optimism. Even if every small rancher in the county shows up, it won't change Judge Hollister's mind if he's already decided. Maybe not, Mason acknowledged, but it will show those railroad investors that securing the right-of-way won't be as simple as Hargrove has promised. He took her hand again, and it will show Hargrove that you're not alone in this fight. Victoria studied their joined hands, her smaller one, tanned and calloused from years of ranch work, nestled within his larger, equally work-worn palm. In that moment, she made a decision that had been forming since the day Mason appeared at her fence line. We're going to need a minister, she said quietly. Mason looked at her in confusion. A minister? For what? Victoria met his gaze steadily. If we're going to be partners in every sense, we should make it official. Before the hearing, understanding dawned in Mason's eyes, followed by a joy so pure it transformed his face. Victoria, are you saying? I'm saying yes to your partnership proposal, in business and in life, she replied, surprising herself with her certainty. If we lose tomorrow, they can't separate a wife from her husband nearly as easily as they can evict a single woman. And if we win, I'll be the luckiest man in Montana Territory, Mason finished, pulling her gently to her feet and into his arms. The kiss that followed was tentative at first, then deepening as years of solitude and caution gave way to a connection that felt as inevitable as the changing seasons. When they finally separated, both breathless, Mason rested his forehead against hers. Are you certain? He asked. This isn't how I imagined courting you. Victoria laughed softly. When have I ever done things the expected way? She drew back slightly to look into his eyes. I know my own mind, Mason McKenzie, and my heart. Then let's find that minister tonight, Mason said, his voice husky with emotion. I don't want to wait another day to call you my wife. The night that followed was a whirlwind of activity. They rode into Utica together, going first to the small clapboard church where Reverend Phillips lived in rooms behind the sanctuary. The elderly minister was surprised by their late-night visit but touched by their story and the urgency of their situation. Ordinarily, I prefer more preparation before performing a wedding, he said, studying them over his spectacles. But these are extraordinary circumstances, and I sense a genuine bond between you. He agreed to marry them immediately, sending his wife to find witnesses among their neighbors. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, conducted by lamplight in the modest church with only Reverend and Mrs. Phillips and two hastily summoned neighbors in attendance. Victoria wore the same riding clothes she'd traveled in, while Mason removed his hat and gun belt but otherwise remained in his trail-worn attire. Yet as they spoke their vows, exchanging the simple gold band Mason had purchased years ago as a memento of his mother's wedding ring, Victoria felt a rightness that transcended their unusual circumstances. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Mason's lips met hers to seal their covenant, She knew with bone-deep certainty that she had found her partner in every sense of the word. After the ceremony, they rode back to the ranch in the darkness, both physically exhausted but spiritually buoyed by the commitment they had made. Their arrival at the cabin, now their shared home, had a different quality, an awareness of boundaries crossed and lives irrevocably joined. Inside, Mason built up the fire while Victoria prepared for bed behind the privacy screen in the corner. When she emerged in her simple cotton nightgown, Mason stood by the hearth, his expression a mixture of tenderness and uncertainty. "I know this isn't a typical wedding night," he said softly. "If you want to wait," Victoria crossed the room and placed her fingers gently against his lips, silencing him. "I don't want to wait for anything with you, Mason. Not when tomorrow is so uncertain." He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Whatever happens at that hearing, we'll face it together, as husband and wife." Victoria smiled, leading him toward the bed that had until now been hers alone. "Yes, together." The intimacy that followed was a revelation for both tender, passionate, and ultimately profound in its joining of two souls who had found in each other the home they had separately been seeking. Afterward, lying in Mason's arms as the fire burned low, Victoria felt a peace that transcended the looming threat to their land and livelihood. "No matter what Judge Hollister decides tomorrow," she whispered against Mason's chest, "they can't take this from us." Mason's arms tightened around her. "No," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Some things are beyond the reach of even the most powerful men." They rose before dawn, preparing for the day ahead with the quiet efficiency of those accustomed to hard work and early mornings. As Victoria pinned up her hair and donned her best dress, a modest navy blue affair she wore for trips to town, Mason slipped a folded paper into her hand. "I wrote this last night while you were dressing for our wedding," he said. "It's a formal declaration of our partnership, both in marriage and in the ranch. I've signed it and had Reverend Phillips witness it." Victoria unfolded the document, reading the careful script that officially joined Mason McKenzie to her land and her life. "This is legally binding," she noted with surprise. Mason nodded. "Sullivan confirmed it when we were in Helena. As your husband, I have legal standing regarding any decisions about the property." He cupped her face gently. "I want Judge Hollister to understand that challenging your claim means challenging both of us now." They rode into Utica together just as the town was coming to life. To Victoria's astonishment, the area around the courthouse was already filled with people, not just the small ranchers Jim Watkins had promised to rally, but townspeople as well, including shopkeepers, the blacksmith, and families Victoria recognized from church services. As they dismounted, Jim hurried over to them, grinning broadly. "Word spread faster than wildfire," he said proudly. "Seems you're not the only one tired of Hargrove and his cronies running roughshod over folks." Mason surveyed the crowd, which grew larger by the minute. "Any sign of trouble?" "Sheriff's keeping his distance," Watkins replied. "His deputies are nervous, though. They didn't expect this kind of turnout." Victoria noticed several men watching from the doorway of the hotel across the street, well-dressed Easterners, who could only be the railroad investors Mayor Hargrove had been expecting. They were speaking animatedly among themselves, gesturing toward the gathering crowd with evident concern. Inside the courthouse, the scene was equally remarkable. The small hearing room was filled to capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. At the front, Mayor Hargrove sat with his attorneys, his florid face betraying his displeasure at the unexpected public interest in what he had clearly intended to be a quiet legal formality. Judge Hollister entered from a side door, his black robes flowing as he took his seat at the bench. A tall, austere man with a perpetual frown, he surveyed the crowded room with evident surprise. "This is a simple property hearing, not a public spectacle," he announced, banging his gavel for order. Those without direct interest in the case should depart immediately. No one moved. Instead, a murmur ran through the crowd, growing louder until one of the ranchers Victoria recognized called out, "We all have an interest in seeing justice done, Your Honor." The judge's frown deepened. "Silence, or I'll have the sheriff clear the room." He shuffled the papers before him. "We are here to address concerns regarding the validity of a land claim currently held by Victoria Remington for a parcel east of Utica. Mayor Hargrove, representing the town council, has challenged this claim on technical grounds." He peered over his spectacles. "Is Miss Remington present?" Victoria stepped forward, Mason at her side. "I am, Your Honor, though it's Mrs. McKenzie now." A ripple of surprise ran through the room. Judge Hollister blinked in confusion. "Mrs. McKenzie?" "Victoria Remington McKenzie," she clarified. "My husband and I were married last night by Reverend Phillips." She presented the marriage certificate and partnership agreement. "Mason McKenzie is now my legal partner in all matters, including the ranch." Judge Hollister accepted the documents, examining them with evident dismay. This was clearly an unexpected development that complicated the proceedings. Mayor Hargrove leaned forward, whispering urgently to his attorney. "These appear to be in order," the judge finally said, returning the papers. "However, they do not address the underlying issue of the original land claim's validity." He gestured to Mayor Hargrove. "The plaintiff may present his case." Hargrove's attorney rose. A slick-looking man with a gold watch chain stretched across his ample belly. "Your Honor, we contend that the transfer of the land claim from Richard Remington to his daughter was improper, as it occurred after his death and before the claim was properly filed with the Territorial Land Office." Victoria stepped forward again. "Your Honor, I have certified documentation from the Helena Land Office confirming the legality of the transfer." She presented the sealed packet they had obtained from Colonel Jameson. The judge examined these new documents with growing discomfort, particularly Colonel Jameson's letter explicitly supporting the validity of Victoria's claim. Mayor Hargrove's attorney attempted to argue that the circumstances were still unusual enough to warrant reconsideration, but his arguments grew increasingly convoluted as he tried to navigate around the clear evidence supporting Victoria's position. Throughout the proceedings, Mason stood beside Victoria, his presence a silent declaration of support. The crowd remained as well, watching attentively as the legal maneuverings unfolded, their collective presence a palpable force in the small courtroom. Finally, Judge Hollister held up a hand to stop the increasingly desperate arguments from Hargrove's attorney. "I have reviewed the evidence presented by both parties," he announced, his tone resigned. "While the circumstances surrounding the transfer of the Remington claim were indeed unusual, the documentation provided by Mrs. McKenzie clearly establishes the legality of her ownership." A murmur of approval ran through the crowd. Victoria felt Mason's hand find hers, squeezing gently in silent celebration. Furthermore, the judge continued, Colonel Jameson's letter from the Territorial Land Office explicitly supports the claim's validity. This court has no grounds to overrule the determination of the proper regulatory authority. He banged his gavel decisively. The challenge to the Remington-McKenzie land claim is dismissed. The courtroom erupted in cheers. Victoria turned to Mason, who swept her into an embrace that lifted her feet from the floor. Around them, their neighbors and newfound supporters offered congratulations and backslaps of approval. Mayor Hargrove rose from his seat, his face purple with fury. "This isn't over," he sputtered, pointing a finger at Victoria and Mason. "The railroad will get that right of way, one way or another." The room fell silent at his outburst. Mason gently set Victoria down and turned to face the mayor. "Perhaps it's time to discuss a different route for your railroad spur," he suggested calmly. "One that respects existing property rights." "Impossible," Hargrove snapped. The surveys are clear. The only viable route is through that land. From the back of the courtroom, a new voice spoke up. That's not entirely accurate, Mayor Hargrove. All heads turned to see a distinguished man in an expensive suit step forward, one of the Eastern investors Victoria had noticed earlier. Andrew Caldwell, Northern Pacific Railroad. He introduced himself. Our engineers have identified an alternative route that would bypass the Remington property entirely. Mayor Hargrove gaped at him in shock. But you said, I said we would consider your proposed route if all rights-of-way could be secured legally and without controversy. Caldwell corrected him smoothly. Given the circumstances and the evident public sentiment, I believe pursuing the alternative route would be in everyone's best interests. He nodded toward Victoria and Mason, including the preservation of a productive ranch that contributes to the local economy. The meaning was clear. The railroad had no interest in becoming entangled in a controversial property dispute that had galvanized local opposition. Hargrove's promise of an easy acquisition had proven false, and the investors were cutting their losses. As the crowd dispersed, many stopping to congratulate Victoria and Mason on both their legal victory and their marriage, Caldwell approached them directly. Mrs. McKenzie, Mr. McKenzie, he greeted them, offering his hand. I want to personally apologize for any distress this situation has caused you. The Northern Pacific has no desire to expand at the expense of legitimate landowners. Victoria accepted his handshake, still somewhat dazed by the rapid turn of events. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell, though I suspect your alternative route will cost the railroad more to construct. Caldwell smiled thinly. Perhaps in immediate expenditure, but the goodwill of the communities we serve has its own value. He glanced toward Mayor Hargrove, who was being berated by several townspeople near the door. Besides, I suspect the political landscape in Utica may be changing soon. After Caldwell departed, Victoria and Mason made their way outside, where they were met with continued congratulations from their supporters. Jim Watkins approached, grinning broadly. Told you folks would stand with you, he said proudly. Nothing brings people together like standing up to bullies. He winked at Mason. And congratulations on the wedding. About time this one found herself a good man. Victoria laughed, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Thank you, Jim, for everything. As they prepared to return to their ranch, their home, Mason pulled Victoria aside, drawing her into a quiet corner of the street. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket and withdrawing a small package wrapped in brown paper. I picked it up in Helena while you were meeting with the land clerk. Victoria unwrapped it to find a small silver pendant on a delicate chain, a tiny house with a heart-shaped window. It's beautiful, she whispered, touched by the thoughtful gift. I wanted you to have something to commemorate our partnership, Mason explained as he fastened the chain around her neck. A symbol that home isn't just a place, but the people we share it with. Victoria touched the pendant where it rested against her collarbone, then reached up to cup Mason's face in her hands. I never expected to find you, she said softly. Never imagined that the cowboy standing at my fence line would become the man standing beside me for life. Mason smiled, covering her hands with his own. Sometimes the best things in life are the ones we don't see coming. They rode home together in the golden afternoon light. The Montana landscape spread before them like a promise. The ranch that had been Victoria's solitary kingdom for 3 years now felt transformed, not diminished by sharing, as she might once have feared, but expanded by the presence of someone who valued it, and her as fiercely as she did herself. As they crested the final rise and their cabin came into view, Victoria reined in her horse for a moment, taking in the sight of the home she had fought so hard to protect. Mason stopped beside her, following her gaze. What are you thinking? He asked. Victoria turned to him, her heart full. I'm thinking about all the possibilities ahead of us. The ranch we'll build together. The life we'll share. She reached for his hand. I'm thinking that I'm no longer standing alone. Mason lifted her hand to his lips. You never will be again, he promised. That's what partnership means. They rode the final distance side by side, returning to the land that had brought them together, a cowboy who had found his purpose and a woman who had found her match, united in love and determination on the wild frontier of Montana Territory. 10 years later, the McKenzie Ranch had grown to 3 times its original size, with a herd of prize cattle that commanded top prices at market and a reputation for quality that extended throughout the territory. The original cabin had been expanded into a proper ranch house, with a wide porch where Mason and Victoria often sat in the evenings, watching their children play in the yard. 8-year-old Richard, named for Victoria's father, had his mother's auburn hair and determination, while 6-year-old Elizabeth and 4-year-old James shared their father's darker coloring and quiet thoughtfulness. The sound of their laughter filled the house that had once known only Victoria's solitude. Utica had changed as well. Mayor Hargrove had indeed lost the next election, replaced by a blacksmith who understood the value of balancing progress with respect for individual rights. The railroad spur had been built along the alternative route, bringing prosperity to the region without sacrificing Victoria and Mason's land. On the 10th anniversary of the day Mason had stood at Victoria's fence line with a rifle, they hosted a gathering for all those who had supported them during that pivotal hearing. The ranch yard was filled with neighbors, friends, and even Andrew Caldwell, who had eventually become a business associate as the McKenzies expanded their operations. As twilight fell and lanterns were lit around the property, Victoria found Mason standing at the eastern fence line, gazing out over land that now featured lush pastures, sturdy outbuildings, and a stream diverted to provide reliable water for their growing herd. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, slipping her arm through his. Mason turned to her, the years having added dignity to his features without diminishing the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her. "I was remembering that first day," he said, nodding toward the spot where he had taken his stand. "I never imagined where it would lead." Victoria leaned her head against his shoulder. "When I saw you standing there with that rifle, I thought you might be another threat, not the greatest blessing of my life." "We've built something remarkable here," Mason said, his gaze taking in not just the land but the gathering of people who had become their extended family. "Something worth fighting for." "We still have more to build," Victoria replied, taking his hand and placing it gently against her abdomen, where their 4th child had just begun to make its presence known. Mason's eyes widened, then filled with joy as he understood her meaning. "Victoria," he breathed, pulling her close. "Really?" She nodded, smiling at his reaction. "Really. Spring will bring a new addition to the McKenzie family." Mason swept her into his arms, mindful of her condition but unable to contain his happiness. "I fall in love with you more each day," he said, his voice husky with emotion. Victoria wrapped her arms around his neck, as certain in this moment as she had been on the day they wed that she had found her true partner in all things. "And I with you, my steadfast cowboy." As they returned to their guests hand in hand, Victoria reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a solitary woman defending her land against impossible odds to the heart of a thriving family and community. The town had wanted to take her land by force, and a cowboy had stood at her fence line with a rifle. What had begun as a stand against injustice had blossomed into a love that had transformed not just 2 lives, but an entire community. It was, Victoria thought as she watched Mason swing their youngest son into his arms, the kind of story that might someday be told around frontier campfires, a testament to the power of courage, principle, and the unexpected paths that lead to home.